The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called in his master's debtors, one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And you, how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones. And the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If therefore you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I think on a good day and with most parables, Jesus' preaching is a little bit of a challenge to understand. But I don't know whether or not this is a good day. I think it's a good day. This is a very, very tough parable. So what I want to do is give some big thoughts that we have to hold on to in our interpretation of the parable, and let you do like the working out of the thing on your own time. And I'll bring it back to Jesus' point of exhortation at the end of the parable, which I think gives us even better orientation. So yeah, well, what do we have? We have a rich man and a steward. And this image, right from the beginning, we ought to hear, this is God and Israel. Jesus would have just assumed that the people that he's talking to, whether or not here we're told these are his disciples, or even his adversaries, whenever you have this kind of relationship, you're looking at God and Israel. Then it gets, that's like the best thing I can say. Everything else becomes very, very confusing. I think the more you dig into it, sometimes that's what you get. Is kind of that kind of crying. It's a particular kind of crying. It's like a, frustrated, I don't know why I'm here crying. But this is it with this parable. Then you have, I think also the challenge is that you have like two negatives. Jesus is really condemning the practices of the people of his time, but he's doing it with a negative image. So then you have the peculiarity that the owner of the great wealth or whatever is commending his steward for dishonest practices. It's like that two negative thing also is very confusing. But what we see is that I do have to say, in order to understand the parable at all, I think you need at least the context to understand. Yeah, we need the context of the way these transactions would have worked to even see how the owner could commend the dishonesty of, or the injustice of what the steward does. So he has them come forward, and this is the mechanism. He has them come forward and say what they owe his master. And they owe, what, 100 and 100. They owe 100 measures of olive oil and 100 cores of wheat. Those are the two. And then you see him say, okay, write one for 50. So for the oil, write one for 50, and for the wheat, write one for 80. So in that day, usury wasn't just outlawed. You know what I mean? Not simply the charging of interest, but beyond. I don't know if I'd say it's loan sharking, but it's somewhere between the two. And it's very difficult to dig into that and figure out like what this all means, especially the biblical prohibitions against loaning with interest. So there's like whether or not that practice is acceptable at all. And I know this, like, well, look, for anyone who's like in the money world, right? Well, look, you have to loan at interest. When you give money to someone, you're foregoing the right to have that money and make it work for you so that you get more money. And that person is loaning it in order to get more for themselves. So maybe you should be able to get in on that as well. I get the economics of it, but part of the reason why I want to dig in there is to say that economics doesn't have say certain steadfast laws. We make it up. We make that stuff up. So there are good reasons why you would have interest on loans, but it doesn't have to be that way. And taking seriously what the Bible says is significant at those points. I'm just saying that there's a lot of work to reshape our imaginations that is indicated by the scriptures that we rarely take up for ourselves. We assume the way things are the way things should be, or like this is just the playing field and we have to work within it. I think that's fine. And I'll say it's fine even if you read St. Paul's letter, which we just heard, the second reading. He basically says the same thing. He knows that the world is in need of conversion, but he's saying pray for people in authority, pray for kings. He didn't say, go and undermine them, upstage them, root them out, revolt against them. He didn't say that. He said pray for them, because he knew he was focused completely on the conversion of the faithful's hearts and minds, which then has ecological significance in the sense that if we are changed in this space, when we leave this space, we will necessarily change the world. It happens actually just like that. It happens naturally as a result of our being changed. So the focus actually is on our having hearts and minds that are converted to God, and that happens through exploration of His Word and the rest. Okay, anyway, sidetracked. This makes it more difficult as well. I apologize. Okay, so he has them come in, 100 and 100, and he says, write one for 50 and one for 80. So he just gave the one a 50% discount on his loan, and the other one 20%. He doesn't owe it anymore. He owes the master 50, the one, and the other one owes the master 80, not 100. To get around the practice of, to get around the prohibition against loaning at interest, or with interest, or loaning in a more usurious manner, people of Jesus' time would loan not money, but goods. So the idea would be that the oil actually that was given to the one man by the master was 50 measures of oil. And he gave him 50 measures of oil, expecting 100 measures in repayment to get around the prohibition. And the other would have been given 80 cores of wheat and expected to return 100 to get around the prohibition. So there, the steward has an opportunity to do what? To split the difference, or to get away with what? Using the goods that his master has entrusted to him, and the management of the goods entrusted to him, to gain favor for himself in a space where the owner, the rich man, cannot come forward and present charges against him for squandering his wealth. Because he's in the wrong already for loaning with interest, or loaning with a usurious interest. So he's totally vulnerable there. And the steward then exploits that in order to get a softer landing spot when he leaves the stewardship of the master. Okay? There's more to it than that, believe it or not. There's more to it than that. But before you get bewildered, I am just assigning it to you as homework. So we're not gonna work through it, because again, you have to take those things into account and then say, okay, God is the rich man, and the steward is Israel. Now let me give you the back door into the same thing. Yeah? Because what Jesus does in the end in his exhortation is he gives us a sense of what's going on, what's going wrong for Israel. Let me see. Yeah, okay, I'll do it in that order. What's going wrong? Yeah? He looks right at the end and says, no servant can serve two masters. This is the problem. This is what's going on. This is the problem. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. So you cannot serve both God and riches or wealth or money, right? That's where we are. And it's a really forcible critique that Jesus issues elsewhere in the scriptures to the scribes and Pharisees. We hear that they are lovers of money. And that means that their lives center on the accumulation of wealth and money. And here, you cannot have two masters. What is it? It means that we all have priorities, right? You know that you have priorities, right? Yes? Yeah, some people don't. I mean, I work with a lot of people, they don't realize that they have priorities. I think these are the things that you devote most or more of your attention to, your energy, your waking hours, right? I like to work it the other way and say something like, your schedule reveals your priorities. Sometimes it reveals that you just want to live a sloppy, a sloppy life. You want to live like a sloppy, unaccountable existence. Sometimes but that's a priority. That's a priority itself. But usually it reveals, if you look at the time you spend on activities, usually that is some indication of your priorities. Also, like what you spend money on, right? What you spend time on, what you talk about, what you think about when no one's talking at you like I'm talking at you right now. Or maybe what you're thinking about right now. Maybe that's your priority, right? You don't get to have two top priorities. Because inevitably, they come into conflict, and you have to choose one or the other. And which do you choose? So this is one way of backing into what Jesus is talking about in terms of you can't serve both God and mammon. But the other point is this, because these are not like simple distinctions where you say, actually, yeah, that's my priority, so that affects this part of my life. And that's my second priority, and that affects this. And actually they don't. I'm pretty well, I can hold it all kind of in peaceful balance if I just put them in the right positions and that kind of thing. That is not the way it works. It's not the way it works. Your top priority is expressed in almost everything you do. That's the realization. It's the realization that we make not only in this scripture passage, but in our life of worship. Right? We are here to worship God, which means that we are here to do this thing, namely offering our hearts and our lives to Him in praise, that makes Him the true and living center of our hearts and lives. We realize that we don't do this naturally, and we need a lot of help to do it. So have corporate worship in order to have our lives center on the true and living God. But once we center on the true and living God, then everything flows from that. Our whole manner of being, right, habits of heart and mind, they flow from our centering on the true and living God. At least they should. And this was Jesus' challenge to the people of his day. It remains the challenge of the challenge that he's going to issue to us today. where were they? They were centered on money. It means that they saw their lives of relationship as transactions. If you do it that way, then you will be accounting in everything you do, and for your time with everyone you're spending time with. And if it doesn't get that serious, it still is very serious, because it changes everything. Just in the same way that the people were established to worship the true and living God, and that meant then that they were supposed to be authentic reflections of who He is, which is nothing other than radical generosity. Live a life totally for the other. And that means that people, on the personal level, people are committed to the true and living God, will live out themselves a life of radical generosity. But then also in their families and in their communities and in the world more generally, also the same habits of heart apply. Such that they will be a people, so Israel would be a people totally for the other, only because God is at the center of their hearts and lives. He's at the center of their hearts and lives on a personal level. He's at the center of their hearts and lives even on a national level. So they ought to be, as a people, reflecting God's generosity. And they are not. They are not doing it. And so this is the time of their visitation. God is on the scene to judge them as wanting in their stewardship of what He entrusts to them. They are not a people for the other. They are a people for themselves. And Jesus is on the scene to condemn that. But not just condemn it, right? He has to, because people are stuck in their habits of heart and mind. They are rooted in their priorities. And it means he has to uproot the idols in order for Him to be at the center. And He has to do all that work, not just for them 2,000 years ago, but for us now. He has to do that work. That's about it. No. It is about it. He has to do that work in us. So now this is it for me, okay? The focusing moment. We can only do it because Jesus is the new Israel. Yeah? So he is living out the way that God always wanted His people to go. That call to be, to reflect God's generous love comes to Jesus. And He lives it out. He is totally for the other. He gives His life entirely to God in praise, and He gives His life away completely in God's service. He's totally for the other. And He calls a people to Himself to live that life together, both with personally, hearts and minds fixed on Jesus, and then together so that we could develop those habits of heart and mind that the communities need in order to live God-centeredness. But it's always Jesus at the center. Okay, so He lives it, and then He has called us, He has summoned us to live it with the power that He breathes into us in His Spirit. His own life of love breathed into us so that we could be totally for the other. So He makes it possible, but He's also set our sights on what it is we need to be about. We need to be a people for the other. We need to be a people that has the true and living God as the center of our hearts and lives. And when that happens, via worship, prayer, service, giving, the like, we recognize ourselves to be transformed people, transformed into personal expressions of God's radical generosity. And that's the point. And what does it mean? Well, we do all the things that come as a result of that and are related to that. It is things like dedicating our time to God, dedicating our days to God, praying, right? Being serious about our life of prayer. It does mean serving. It means giving in a way that the world wouldn't even recognize, right? We're made to be the most generous people the world has ever seen. Are we? But all that stuff, and also in the way of love. Always in the way of love. And we can do even the most impossible things we can do as a result of our being reflections of God's radical generosity. We can even forgive people. We can even forgive as expressions of God's radical generosity. We go totally over the top in the giving of ourselves, because we'll never outdo God in his generosity. And he is faithful to us in continuing to pour himself out for us, pour himself out, his own life of love poured into our hearts and lives, so that we could be who we were made to be. And in so being, be the effect in the world that God intends us to be.